So we're going to start out with Jon Sanders, who's Director of Center for Food, Power, and Life and Research, Editor for the John Locke Foundation. And John's going to come up and give us a presentation on occupational licensing. John?
Thank you, Representative Riddell and Representative Zenger and all the esteemed members here, and thanks for having me. My name is Jon Sanders. I'm Director of the Center for Food, Power, and Life at the John Locke Foundation. And those of you, I'm sure, know the John Locke Foundation. We are a free market-oriented think tank focused on North Carolina policy. And today I want to talk about occupational licensing. In my previous gig with Locke, I did a lot on regulatory policy, which is kind of like getting involved in everything. But fortunately, I didn't have to deal with healthcare or education. They didn't let me have to mess with that. So before I get into it, I want to remind everyone here that we have a constitutional right recognized in the state of North Carolina in our state constitution. Article 1, Section 1 lists that among the inalienable rights that are inalienable to each and every one of us, is the enjoyment of the fruits of our own labor. And then that is listed alongside of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's important because, I mean, you recognize those words from the Declaration of Independence, but we put them in our state constitution, and then we added this labor freedom right along with it. So what is occupational licensing? Occupational licensing is an entry barrier that gets in between you and your field of labor, your ability to do work until you have jumped through all the hoops and jumped over all the hurdles that a state licensing board puts before you. It's considered North Carolina's most restrictive occupational regulation. This graph that I've put alongside on the sheet is from the Program Evaluation Division's 2000 report on occupational licensing that lists level of restriction of regulation on occupations alongside of the form and the risk to public welfare. As you can see, it considers licensure the most restrictive, and the reason for it is it's to be used only when the risk to public welfare is highest. So one of the questions always is, what's the extent of licensure in North Carolina? And I will explain why that's a difficult question to answer, but the Commerce Department's, their BOLD database, which I've got a picture of, says there are 931 licenses currently in North Carolina. But looking through that list, some of them are special events permitting and privilege licenses. The EDPNC puts out that there are about 950, so they've got around the same count. They break it down into 319 occupational licenses, 498 business licenses, and then a combined business occupational license of around 80. Breaking it down into licenses for lower income occupations, which is something the Institute for Justice has been doing for the last decade. Their most recent report, which came out at the end of last year, shows that North Carolina licenses 66 out of the 102 lower income occupations that they have recognized, and only 12 states require more licenses for lower income occupations in North Carolina. Now, regulated practices will exceed the official count of occupational licensing because of it's actually hard to figure out how many there are, because it really relates to entrepreneurial ingenuity. So those of you know the major case middle of last decade that involved teeth whiteners. Well, teeth whiteners are not listed among the occupations and licenses. So, but someone who wanted to sell teeth whitening services was prevented. Another one that's frequently before the General Assembly, reflexologists. They are also not listed in the business's occupational license database. So basically, if there's a practice that someone comes up with and wants to earn a living on, and it falls afoul of a scope of practice as defined by a licensing board, it might not be on the list, but it will be on their list. There we go. So why do we do it? Well, the main reason we do it is from the expected benefit that we are going to protect the health, safety, and welfare of North Carolinians from bad practices, from unsafe practitioners. And so we would ensure the safety and quality of the work that's going to be produced. But as an economist, I know not to look just at expected costs, but I want to look, at expected benefits. I want to look at expected costs. So what are the expected costs of licensure? Well, those break down into several different categories. First one would be the expected cost to would-be workers. They would have to forego work, do work in other fields while they are, while they are working their way through the randomly assigned, arbitrarily assigned classes to satisfy educational credits for the license, sitting for the arbitrarily assigned amount of required examinations to get the license. Some licenses require time spent logging job experience. Many require criminal background checks, and of course the license and renewal fees. These costs are not felt equally. They will fall hardest on the poor. They will fall hardest on those of lesser education. Research shows they fall hard on minorities, but also mothers returning to the workforce, migrants moving here, or people moving here from other states from North Carolina where maybe their field isn't licensed or the requirements aren't as strict as they are in North Carolina. You guys know about relocated military families and have done some good work regarding that. And workers with conviction records that are unrelated to the work they seek to do. But also there are costs to consumers, because limiting the amount of practitioners will end up raising the costs on them, and not just in terms of money in purchasing the services, but also in terms of time, because there would just be fewer options. So sometimes that pushes them to poor and dangerous alternatives, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And the occupational licensing boards can sometimes, because they're field staffed by practitioners, current practitioners, sometimes can be resistant to innovative and new ways of doing things. The cost of the state will be the cost of limited growth in those occupations. Research shows that 20% that states that don't license those occupations will see growth in those occupations 20% faster than they grow in states that do license them. So we'll see less competition, fewer economic opportunities, and then less wealth creation as a result. From the research, Morris Kleiner, who's done the most research, he's a labor economist at the University of Minnesota, has found that the most generally held view in economics on occupational licensing is that it restricts the supply of labor in that occupation, and therefore it drives up the price of labor as well as the price of services rendered, which is good if you're already in the occupation, but it's not good if you are trying to break into the field or if you're a consumer. What are the unintended consequences of licensing? This is something else as an economist that I want to look for, and I urge that policymakers always be aware of the threat and possibility of negative unintended consequences and try to keep an eye out for them. One, the protections don't evolve to the mutual benefits of competition, and I've kind of alluded to that before, but we want to make sure that we protect competition in the state as well as we're trying to protect consumers. Licensing tends to protect established members in the field and block others, and it also could block innovative new ideas, because to the practitioners it may seem like that won't work, and these guys may have come up with a great idea. What this means is that consumers will not enjoy the benefits of competition and the benefits of fresh thinking in the field. And sometimes, and I'll discuss this in a minute, the expected benefits prove elusive, and higher costs can lead consumers to poor and dangerous choices. And that reason for that is because it gets to the difference between inputs and outcomes. Who is doing the work? Licensing focuses on the inputs. It makes sure or seeks to make sure that the practitioners have the education and the qualities that they're looking for, and they're able to pass the test and an exam. So the licensed practitioners may be well suited for the work. The problem is consumers are more focused on outcomes. So if they're blocked from being able to hire an electrician, for example, or the electrician is too expensive for the work that they need done, they're going to do something else. They'll either ignore the problem or decide to put it off for now, which could be a dangerous option. They will maybe do it yourself. I mean, I've done this recently. I don't feel like spending $100 and some visiting fee from an electrician to come for me to replace an outlet. So you look on YouTube, you turn the stuff off, but that puts me at risk, and I don't have that much knowledge. So if I were to get a big head and try to do something a little bit more dangerous, I could end up killing myself. They could get a friend's help, or maybe go and find someone who's willing to do the work under the table, and sometimes they can be taken advantage of and scammed. There's a very strange but a recurring finding in the research literature that I've put on our website is that stricter licensing in states, security guards, has led to more property crimes. For electricians, I just mentioned, more electrocution deaths or accidents in those states with stricter licensing. Stricter licensing of optometrists, high rates of blindness, on down dentists, veterinarians, mortgage brokers. These are ones that I've seen. But the point being is consumers can be dissuaded by the cost and time and money to hire a licensed professional and may end up making poor choices. So that the safety and quality that the state is trying to ensure by the most restrictive form of going to licensing is actually yielding worse results, or can be. I mentioned the IJ study on low-income workers. This is very important because, as Federal Reserve economists have pointed out, entrepreneurship in a low-income area yields what they call a double dividend, because it's not only that the entrepreneur is helping themselves, but they are helping their community by providing needed goods and services in a low-income area, and sometimes also they're providing jobs as well. Entrepreneurship, as we know, is a ladder out of poverty. So we don't want to limit these opportunities if we don't have to. And on the flip side, research finds that the more licensing and the stricter licensing in lower income jobs will result in lower rates of low income entrepreneurship. So how do we determine the right balance? That's a very good question. I favor what's known as a Right to Earn a Living Act. It's something that's passed in Tennessee and Arizona, and the meat of it has basically been passed in Mississippi and Nebraska. But it's a way of looking at providing the state framework for balancing what's the right amount of state regulation in an occupation for the needs that we have. The occupational regulation would need to be restricted to legitimate, and that's a big important word, legitimate health and safety and welfare objectives, not any other objectives, just health, safety, and welfare, and they would have to be legitimate. They would also have to be demonstrably necessary to address those objectives, but then go no further. And then finally, they would have to be carefully tailored to address only those objectives. And those phrases are in the legislation, and they're picked to give guidance to courts on how to adjudicate disputes that come up regarding licensing decisions. The choices that the state has in regulating an occupation are really broad. It's not, like I said earlier, not a matter of licensing or not to license. The main thing, and that's why I like this inverted pyramid, because part of it is the blue shows all the ways that the state can be involved without getting in the way of our Article 1, Section 1 rights and blocking our occupational freedom. The first major one is choice with competition in private litigation. There's nothing that says that you as a competitor and service provider or third parties, reviewers or whatever can come in and say, this is how this service is done, this is how this practitioner is. I know when I'm looking at a hotel, when I'm buying something, I look at reviews. I'm very, very keen on what other people's experiences are. And if you understand that we want to find and ensure quality of service, that's something that knowledge is not limited to this room. Everyone knows this, and so it creates a market opportunity for reviewers, it creates a market opportunity for competitors to say, hey, look, I'm preparing this service and I have this. My competitor does not. And the state is still involved through private litigation, so the court systems can be used. Beyond that, we can step for if we're worried about fraud, you can go to a stronger Deceptive Trade Practices Act. If the real concern is cleanliness, then you've got inspections, bonding and insurance. If you're worried about externalities and costs imposed on third parties, registration. If you're worried with registration with the Secretary of State, if you're worried about fly-by-night companies, certification, or when it gets a little bit more serious, but only until you really have a major risk of public harm and things like medical fields and other things like that. Would you really want to be looking into licensure? A couple of other reforms, and then I'm done, that I really like. Universal license recognition. This is a fairly new reform. I think it's been around since 2019, and so far it's passed in 19 states, most recently this month in the state of Virginia. All this would do is if someone's moving to this state from another state where their line of work is licensed, instead of having, because sometimes the arbitrary requirements, the education requirements, the testing, et cetera, are slightly different. But someone who has been doing the work for a few years in a different state could come here and find that they're 6 credit hours short, or they need to take another test or whatever. And instead of making them have to jump through and satisfy these hoops, they would have to show that they're currently holding a license in another state. They've had it for over a year. They're in good standing and not under any disciplinary proceeding, and that they don't have a disqualifying criminal record. And then they pay their licensing fees here in the state, and then they are able to immediately begin work. The other thing that I really like, it's not been done in any state other than it was an executive order in New Mexico, although it has been presented to a couple of others. It's something called Occupational Licensing Consumer Choice Act. And what that tries to do is it doesn't get rid of any license, but in certain fields, not medical, it would allow an unlicensed practitioner who has maybe moved here from another state that isn't licensed, where that field isn't licensed, or had just come in from the military or whatever, to be able to provide to consumers a non-licensed disclosure form saying, I don't have a license in this state, but I have these credentials, I have this many years of experience in the state of X, I used to do this when I was in the military, or whatever other credentials they have. They would sign it, the consumer would sign it, and then you would not worry about whether or not the consumer has been taken advantage of by someone who is not giving them all the information. They'll have full disclosure. It's the consumer's choice at that point whether or not they feel comfortable doing business with such a person. So those are two other things that I would put before you, and at this point I would yield to any questions.
Thank you very much, John. Any questions from the committee? Yes. Representative Zenger?
Does the board decide how many hours people have to do for continuing education depending on the field, or where does that come from?
It comes from the board, as far as I know.
Okay.
Questions? Representative Ager?
Do you have any good examples of the sort of lower income licensure requirements that are excessive? Specific examples of licensure in North Carolina that are a problem in your mind?
I think one that I would throw out would be for hair braiding.
Okay.
I think I'm trying to remember the exact amount of, but North Carolina seems to require sort of the upper level of hours, of credit hours required to braid hair. This is something that children learn in other countries and just do, but it runs afoul of the scope of practice of hairdressing, and so that tends to be blocked.
Other questions? Representative Brody.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you kind of give me the dividing line between low-income occupations and the next level up? Where does that divide?
I don't remember exactly. That was in the Institute for Justice report, and they have their methodology, but I can't recall exactly what their criteria were for separating out.
Follow up, if you wouldn't mind.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the complaints, though, I hold a general contractor's license, and it's limited, so I can only build a certain amount that size, which was a complaint when inflation started driving up and we started bumping the ceilings, and so we in turn raised that ceiling. But I always talk with the contractor board, and one of the problems they always have is that they're trying to go after unlicensed people. And the only way you find an unlicensed person is somebody generally calls the contractor board, complain about something, and the board says, well, they're not on our list, they're unlicensed. How do you go about tackling the issue of unlicensed people when they cause problems within that scope that you put out of free market labor? Because that's where the problems lie, and I imagine it's everyone has the same thing, but I'm just speaking from experience from the one. We have contractors that go on and do lousy work, or they don't finish, or whatever the reason is, and we find out they're unlicensed. When the board goes after them, this latest decision says that we cannot stop them from doing work. They can continue to do work because of the ruling of the court, but yet they try to go after them, and they have to go through the whole procedure of filing in Superior Court and all that just to get them to stop doing what they're doing that they're supposed to be licensed for. How does that all fit in that concept of free market labor?
Okay, so the question is, how does the board, if we have more of a free market in general contracting labor, then who would prosecute fraud?
Well, let's go that. As I reviewed just what I said, I had a whole bunch of questions in there, so forgive me.
I think we would have to go about it with lawsuits and with if we want to lower the state involvement in it, then pursue on fraud and in those ways.
But
So maybe put the Attorney General.
But you understand that's a big underdoing to try
Yeah.
to do that, which was caused by the courts.
Right.
Yeah.
And it seems like from what you said, especially as fast as it. My wife works for GC, so she used to be a GC. So finding good contractors is very difficult. I understand that, but it already seems to be a real problem.
Let me step in here.
Yeah,
We
yes.
need to move along. Representative Biggs, really quick.
As a realtor, how would this work at protecting homeowners? Now, I'm for deregulation, but the only thing is most of the time we do like a home inspection, things like that. I mean, one of the requirements are, when we did the punch list, is we got to have a licensed contractor to protect the buyer. How would that work, and have you spoke to the realtors to see how they feel about that as far as protecting consumers there?
No, I haven't spoken to the realtors or anyone else really in looking at this. I'm looking at broad ways of trying to. So I would say, first of all, that the realtors could help police themselves. And I see the idea that there are some disreputable members of the practice as something that reputable members could point out and use as a way of advertising their services. In my experience, I knew a really good realtor. We bought a house 7 years ago, and I think the person representing the person that the seller was fairly new and didn't know some things, and so I felt like we benefited from their lack of better representation, but they weren't underserved. They weren't defrauded or anything like that. So I think if that happens, there will need to be better education for consumers, but some of that could be provided by third parties, and some of that could be provided by the realtors themselves.
I'm going to step in one last question. So one of the issues we deal with, and it's hard to work through with occupational licensing, is there are some groups that are so small they can't sustain a board and the cost of the administration. But they would like to practice and be recognized by the state so that they are eligible for health care insurance and things like that, paybacks and so forth. Is there a middle ground somewhere you found or know about in the country that's been used that would be helpful there?
There is a medical reimbursement licensing, which isn't quite the same as occupational licensing. It would be a voluntary thing, and I've written about it. I could send it to you. But it would address the problem of the medical practice. It would address the problem of the medical practice wanting to prove to insurers that they are considered a legitimate practice by the state without getting the state involved in another licensing board.
That would be great. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time, John.